Okay, good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to the second day of the Electronics Watch Virtual Summit 2023. Yesterday, we opened our summit talking about the new regulatory environment to advance workers' rights in public bias supply chain. This was a public session, and you will be able to view the recording on our website. Tomorrow, we will have a affiliates-only session that will bring monitoring partners and public bias in conversation. Let's start with some housekeeping. This session is being recorded. It will be also available as it is a public session. Should you need interpretation, at the bottom of your Zoom window, there is a globe. You can see it here. Just click on it and you can choose French, Spanish, and English. If you need technical assistance, write in the chat directly to Electronics Watch. Please keep your mic muted as usual, and if you have any questions for the speakers, do put them into the chat and I will try to make use of them. Hi, so I will need to rearrange my window. Yeah, let's start. Today's session is titled Battery Supply Chains, Human Rights Violations and Due Diligence. We will explore human rights and labor rights violations in battery supply chains. We will talk about monitoring partners, with monitoring partners, about working conditions in mines, in battery manufacturing facilities, and in semiconductor manufacturing. We will hear from public buyers about their activities to establish human rights due diligence in their battery supply chains. And we will get also an overview of what Electronics Watch is doing and what the Low Emission Vehicle Programme is. To be able to have this very integrated perspective, we will need to jump between speakers very quickly. So we will have short questions, short answers that we hope will be interesting. Let me give you a brief introduction before we dive into the panel. Batteries have become a central focus to many discussions. Human rights violations, industrial development, changes in global dependencies, and so-called de-risking strategies, labor rights violations, new cars, or environmental devastation. Batteries are central for many sectors: electronics, automotive, and also renewable energy. The discussion focuses often very strongly on raw materials that go into a battery: lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, or manganese. The International Energy Agency has looked into what reaching the goals set by the Paris Agreement that says to limit the temperature to 1.5% centigrade above mean for mineral consumption. The results are quite breathtaking, at least for me. For central minerals, we will need to increase consumption between 20 and 40 times, so up to 4,000%. These new batteries we are talking about are complex electronic systems. They need semiconductors, they need printed circuit boards, just to name the most central electronic components, and consumption of these components will rise too. From a global perspective, mining of central minerals happens all over the world, with processing capacities strongly centered on China. Production facilities of electronics components are located mainly in Asia, and this will probably stay that way for some time. Battery manufacturing is currently seeing quite some geographic dynamics. A lot of new battery factories are being developed in Europe and North Africa. Importantly, when it comes to batteries, Chinese companies are leading, both in technology as well as in scale. And companies from South Korea are right on their heels, with companies from Japan following. However, if we want to see a just transition, we cannot only focus on discussing dependencies, technologies, and so-called de-risking strategies. What we need to look at is questions on conditions for workers and communities impacted by the battery supply chains. These need to be brought to the center. We need to ensure that solutions that are positive for the climate do not come at the expense of workers and communities. This is what we want to talk about in this session. So this integrated perspective will lead us through battery supply chain, looking at various levels and also talking to big buyers. To start off, let's first get a general overview what our monitoring partners are currently doing. And for that, I would like to go to Fabrice. Fabrice is the Electronics Watch Director of Monitoring. He has been working for French and European and global unions in several sectors for the last 15 years, focusing on issues related to European social dialogue. Right before Electronics Watch, Fabrice led the Europe and International Affairs consulting activities of Syndex, a cooperative that provides support to worker representatives and trade unionists. Fabrice, one of the Electronics Watch main activities is monitoring. Our monitoring partners are local civil society organizations in production regions. We have already years of experience with monitoring manufacturing and production operations. Where are we currently monitoring mining operations and what are we monitoring there?
Thank you very much, Peter. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to speak French. Right, so what we are doing, very recently we started activities in the mining sector. Usually we were centered or focused on IT. Mining is quite recent, and we started a few years ago focusing on Indonesia and Philippines, that are countries where there are great resources in nickel, for example. And more recently, we started to monitor Bolivia on tin extraction and in RDC. On cobalt. So that's a more recent activity. In full expansion, they are, the global demand on mine is increasing. So the monitoring of mines is crucial, I would say.
And if we look beyond minerals, we are also starting, or we have already started the semiconductors, or did you want to expand? Sorry, that translation was a bit late and I was clicking around.
So no problem, it's normal. On the issue of semiconductors, it's quite recent activity as well. We have developed work on 3 plans, assess regional risk evaluation to understand how industrial basins work, what are the challenges as far as political, social, economic, and industrial and their social consequences. So this is the work we ask to our monitoring partners that are on the site and know the region, and work on the ground where our partners are going to visit the factories and interview the workers, either with an individual interviews or group focus groups. And we have worked in Taiwan with SPA, our partner, Sales People Association, and we are monitoring 5 sites, and in Malaysia as well with our partner. And so there's a lot of work going on. Semiconductors, it's absolutely essential for the IT production, but also for electric vehicles. So there's a great demand. What is at stake is China, of course. Why? Because well, we don't have access to the workers, not physically. So here we have to be creative and to work with new methodologies remotely, thanks to social networks and internet, but that's not going to be enough. So we're going to have to find other ways to talk to the workers directly. Why? Because we need tangible elements more than statements on the internet that are not reliable, not always. So it is an immediate challenge for us. And the last point in our methodologies is training. Training is extremely important. This is the moment we are going to enhance the workers. When they know their rights, they can struggle for them, defend themselves. This is not our priority for us to defend the workers. They should be able to defend themselves. This is very important. And we inform our local partners in order to develop a methodology on monitoring that is aligned with our expectations. So there's this work on the ground. Our colleagues and myself, we travel around to meet our partners and to give them the methodology. We also meet with union members and workers.
Thank you, Fabrice, for this introduction. Now let's turn to our monitoring partners directly to first understand the role different locations play in the battery supply chains. We will talk about different levels in the supply chain in different locations. Let's talk about the Democratic Republic of Congo with Claude Kabemba. Claude has been working for the last 25 years in research and policy on democratic governance and development fields in Africa. He's currently the executive director of Southern African Resource Watch, or SARW. Their work focuses on promotion of a transparent, accountable, and equitable management of natural resources in Africa. Claude, thank you for being here. You have a broad perspective on mining in various African countries, as SARW comprises of experts in countries like South Africa, DRC, and Zambia. But let's focus today on the Democratic Republic of Congo. What role does the DRC and its mines play in the battery supply chain?
Yes, good morning, Peter, Fabrice. I want to first thank you, Electronic Watch, for putting together this very important conversation at a time when the world is struggling to find solutions to how to achieve a just transition, a transition where no one is left behind, and a transition that respects human rights and protect the environment. So it's a very timely conversation. To answer your question, the DRC plays a significant role in the battery supply chain. The DRC is one of the world's resource-rich countries in green minerals needed for green technologies. It has most of the minerals needed for the manufacturing of batteries, EVs batteries. For example, you have cobalt. The DRC holds the world's largest known reserve of cobalt, estimated at 3.5 million tons. It is the world's leading producer of these minerals, of 70% of annual production that it puts on the global market. In 2022, the production was estimated at 115,000 tons of cobalt. That's quite huge for one country. Then it also produces copper. It's the second world producer of copper. You know, copper is an important, we don't talk much more about copper. It's a very important element for batteries, for electrical cars. Then the DRC also just discovered quite a big reserve of lithium, could be one among the biggest in the world in the Manono province. And the DRC also produced manganese, nickel, and rare earth. So we have all that. With this potential, in fact, Fabrice, the DRC is claiming to be a solution country for the climate change crisis. So we have that such an important country when it comes to moving from high carbon economy to the low carbon economy in the world. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. And just briefly, we hear always a lot from the DRC about artisanal and small-scale mining, or ASM. Does large-scale mining exist in DRC? And if so, who is running these mines?
Oh, yes, the DRC has some of the largest large-scale mining companies. Some are underground mines, extract underground mines. Some are open pit mines. Copper and cobalt are dominated by large-scale mines. That happens in the province of Okatanga and Lualaba, which is the capital of cobalt. So the DRC has also gold industrial mines in the east of the country. As far as copper and cobalt, as we are talking about energy transitions are concerned, there are about 19 mining companies in operation, in production of cobalt in the province of Okatanga and Lualaba, and the majority are Chinese owned. Some of the big mines besides that are Kamoto copper mines owned by Glencore. We all know about Glencore, one of the biggest mine commodity trading company in the world. The biggest also producer of cobalt in 2022 in the DRC. And we have Tenke Fungurume owned by CIMOC, a Chinese company, which was the second producer of cobalt in 2022. So the DRC has some of these big mining companies that are really producing copper and cobalt that is going on the international market.
Thank you, Claude. So we should also take a look at LSM, not only to look at ASM. But before that, let's go to Hungary. Why Hungary? We will learn in a second. We invited Linda Szabo from Peripheria to our discussion. Linda is a founding member of the Peripheria Policy and Research Center, a non-partisan independent think tank based in Budapest, focusing on issues around labor and housing, as well as urban and regional development. Linda, welcome. You and your colleagues at Peripheria are working on battery manufacturing in Hungary, where new factories are being announced almost every month, I have the impression. Can you tell us more about Hungary as a manufacturing location in the battery supply chain?
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Peter, for the introduction and for having me here today. Indeed, we have been witnessing a battery manufacturing boom in Hungary in the recent years, as also one of my colleagues, Márton Cirfusz, wrote a whole report about it, which is also available on Peripheria Center's website if you check. But since the late 2010s, Hungary has become the second largest battery manufacturer for electric vehicles in Europe, following Germany. To this sector, mainly the foreign direct investments came from East Asia, including South Korea, Japan, and mainland China, without creating joint ventures, actually. And if all the investments which will be carried out according to the plans, by 2026, the estimated production capacities of these gigafactories will grow to 215 gigawatt hours per year, employing more than 30,000 people. Since Hungary's economic development is very much dependent on the car industry, mainly the German one, which has started producing electric vehicles, battery production has become an important issue for the government too. So what we have seen that the government policies have been heavily subsidizing these foreign investments, actually in various ways, through cash grants, which actually since 2010 do not require settled labor conditions, which is important to emphasize here, or also by designating special economic zones, which means the concentration of the governance of these investments, often leaving the local municipalities out of the planning process, and authorizing special conditions for industrial park investments. This also policies entails land expropriation and extractivism and loose environment and labor regulations. Government supports plans through huge infrastructure developments that demands also massive use of the country's natural resources, while tries to mute the social discontent emerging around these investments, for instance, by pushing public hearings onto online fora.
Thank you. And do you see only battery manufacturing, like the final assembly, or are other parts of the supply chain also in Hungary?
Yeah, not only battery manufacturing is present, but the whole supply chain except for mining, and also except that the processing of minerals that is gaining lithium from water resources is only in a planning phase and providing not much of a sufficient source. But if we want to talk about the supply chain links, we can state that the currently operating SK On and Samsung SDI in Hungary have linked to such OEMs in Europe as the BMW Group, Daimler, Stellantis, or the Ford and the Jaguar Land Rover companies. In the future, the Chinese CATL, e-Power, and Samvoda will most probably produce BMW for BMW as well, and probably Hungary will also have a BYD manufacturing site, which might supply BYD OEM in Europe too.
Thank you. And let's jump now to a more broader perspective. Back to you, Fabrice. As Director of Monitoring, you have a rather good overview of what is happening in countries such as Bolivia, Philippines, and Indonesia. What role do these countries play in the battery supply chains?
So it depends on the countries and the minerals. In the case of Bolivia, for example, where a lot of tin is produced in Bolivia, there are two snatches who treating the tin. So the tin is exported in plaquettes and not in minerals, which is not the case in lithium, which exists also in Bolivia. So the relationship is different. We in the Swatch, we have access to talk in the factories, and my colleague Rossi will talk about it. We were able to talk to these snatches which have great power in this process. There are also snatches in Japan on the nickel, and we have the means to work on Japanese companies. And in Indonesia, there are Australian stakeholders with joint ventures often. So an Australian company is going to have 51 or 49% of the mines in Indonesia. So we have the way to act, because in Australia there are laws on forced labor, so we can work there. But the issue of industrializations is crucial. For example, Indonesia is saying, I don't want to export, I want to industrialize. All of the countries are saying the same, but some cannot. For example, the RC cannot have snatches on their country, in their country. Claude, you tell me if I'm wrong, but they don't have the energy means who are energy consuming. But Indonesia have the means. So we have electronic storage. We have to anticipate there are a number of factory sites that are going to appear in Indonesia with all the problems of extreme pollutions, labor rights violations, etc., which will appear.
Thank you. So I think what is clear is that the system, and we are just highlighting some parts of the supply chain, it's really complex. It's integrating a lot of locations, a lot of companies, and a lot of political and economical structures. So after we have, I don't want to say understood, but highlighted some of these locations, let's turn to the rights violations documented in the locations. And I would like to start with you, Claude, looking at cobalt mining, and let's just focus on cobalt mining, because as we learned, it's a lot in the DRC. What are the central human rights and labor rights violations that you have found over the last years there?
Thank you. I think what I'm going to say is not a fit-all scenario. I think that it's important. Companies are quite different in the treatment of their workers to some degrees, and in different areas. What I'm sharing here are some of the labor problems you will find in majority of industrial cobalt mines. First of all, one of the things that you get, and when you speak to workers, is the lack of openness in their hiring process. The process most of the time lack transparency, and they have a report of corruption in hiring process. My sense is that it mostly has to be linked to Congolese managers who have been given the responsibility to hire people. We've also speaking to labor, to workers, they've referred to the lack of openness. To some companies, workers have reported being changed from their work position. They'll hire you as a driver, they'll change you to another position without your consent. And this happens quite often. And that they've picked up as a serious human rights problem. There are also problems related to job contract. Some workers report that they do not receive job contracts, and that is against Article 46 of the Congolese labor law. Working hours, quite excessive working hours, has been reported as quite a regular thing that happened to workers. Some workers have reported to work 12 hours working days, some from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. With some have reported no weekly leaves, where workers report that they often work without weekly rest. Instead, workers must sign a statement which says, I will voluntarily give up this rest and choose to continue working. The argument here is important. Sometimes they pay them very little for the hours they are overtime that they are going to do. And for people who earn so little, when they add a little bit of dollars, $2 or $3 for the overtime, they are prepared to sacrifice their security, their health to work for those hours. No overtime sometimes, and in fact, workers, they say sometimes they work overtime without pay. And in the condition of the DRC, we need to understand where unemployment is so high. When you've got a job, and even when it's paid little, and you know it's against the law, you are obliged to remain in that slave work simply because there is no alternative. And complaining could see you put out of that job. We have health and safety problems, which workers have reported, occupational hazard at mining companies, which include a lot of accidents. Sometimes companies do not report accidents, chronic illness, back pain, hearing problem impairment, and all this, they've not been really researched to look at the impact of this mining on the health of the people and the ability to take these companies to court for the damage they've done to people and lack of compensation. We've seen in South Africa serious lawsuits against mining companies because of TB and silicosis. And recently there is a case going for coal mining companies. So in the DRC, we have not reached that level of holding companies to account. There is also the lack of personal protective equipment in some mining companies, but not all. Occupational health and safety, no committees to engage with companies. That's a big problem, I think. Wage and benefits in some companies really are very bad, not negotiated, their wages are imposed. We have also, speaking to lack of freedom of associations, and where you find that companies work in isolation and little information is available for workers' rights due to the weaknesses of trade unions. In some companies, they don't allow that association. So not all companies have a mechanism, for example, Peter, for resolving all these problems, these complaints with workers. So that lack of redress mechanism in place is a big challenge for workers, and they find it very difficult to engage company managers. The phenomenon of subcontracting, where labor also leads to discrimination in terms of wages, where it's the middleman that is paid more than the worker, and the social benefit between workers directly linked to the company and those dependent to subcontractors, even if they engage in some of the most difficult tasks. So these are some, very quickly, Peter, some of the challenges that workers in the cobalt mines in the DRC are facing.
Thank you, Claude. That was very, very good, or very bad. The situation is very bad, but it's a very good description. Sorry for that. Turning now again to Hungary. So, Linda, battery manufacturing is a relatively new industry as such, and it is even a bit newer in Hungary. But do you already have some insights into the situation of workers in Hungary in this sector?
Right. Yes. So I would highlight two major trends that are important for us to see, because I think that features of battery manufacturing, not only in Hungary, but in general. And one is the Foxconnization of labor conditions, meaning that these jobs are low pay, low skills, which are created at battery manufacturing sites. And the other is the fragmentation of labor, which derives back to the fact of the global labor shortage, and what also Claude mentioned now, that the increasing role of the temp agencies or the brokers who in the recruitment. But talking about the Foxconnization of labor conditions, I think the most important thing is about the changes in the base wage, because before, when we talked about combustion engine production, the base wage consisted 80% of the monthly income of a person. And when we are talking about electric vehicles at battery manufacturing, it consists only 50% of the monthly income, meaning much more dependency on the fringe benefits and also the supervisor's subjective judgments of one's performance. It also doesn't have that at many companies, we see that 1 or 2 days off from work due to illness, let alone strike, oftentimes means the loss of performance or attendance bonus for the whole month. This kind of uncertainty, which also drives people to work in 12-hour shifts as much as possible. And when we think about occupational health and safety issues, this overwork does have a serious effect on people's health in the mid-run. But working with chemicals, there are very severe accidents that can happen at these factories. And then we also encounter the problem of a kind of obstruction of medical care, either by paying doctors at the company to take care of the people concerned, but without reporting the accidents to avoid the penalty fees to be paid, or by calling a person from the outside and not telling the doctor what kind of chemical contaminated one's eyes, for instance, because that was referred to as trade secret, and then the person cannot be properly treated. So that's a serious thing, and also the state does not protect workers enough. The penalty fees are maximum 26,000 euros, which is very little compared to the annual profit of these companies. There is a lack of capacities in terms of labor inspectors. There are less than 50 in the whole country. The Occupational Health and Safety Act was amended in a way that the responsibility of becoming familiar with the health and safety instructions put on the shoulders of the individual workers by putting all the training materials online without proper supervision. And as I said, the state subsidizes these investments without the requirement to really have settled labor conditions. And just one brief comment about the fragmentation of the labor, where I said that there is an increasing role of temp agencies in recruitment in Hungary, meaning less protection on the labor market during the probation period, also in case of the dismissals. that also causes tension among workers and much more difficulties in worker representation. So, right.
If you could just briefly maybe touch on the potential, is there a risk of forced labor in this sector in Hungary, or would you say there is no risk?
Well, yeah, there is. So, well, we have not seen clear cases of forced labor yet at the battery companies, but similar to the ITC sector, the labor of agency workers is becoming more and more important. And in ITC, we have encountered the problem of forced labor through the requirement of the repayment of recruitment fees by workers in case they want to leave the workplace. That happened in case of Filipino workers. So we may expect some similar issues in the battery manufacturing sector too, especially that now there is a guest worker law on the table, which was once introduced and repealed because it was considered not harsh enough to control the migration of workers, but that also already didn't contain any guarantee against forced labor, basically.
Thank you. And now to you, Fabrice. With you, we have this very global perspective. Could you first talk briefly about the rights violations in mining, and then maybe directly also talk a bit about semiconductors, what we see in both sectors from a very global perspective?
So, yes, you're right. As Claude was stating, there are lots of problems in terms of safety and health. And he explained that very well. But I would like to insist on the fact that we are very much turned into remedy rather than prevention. And well, it cannot work this way because it's not that miners do not want to prevent. It's only that they do not have the means to prevent. They don't have the knowledge or the equipment to get protected. And a second major problem, and I'm talking here about cooperatives and craft work, there's also the problem of wages. In craft work, miners are not employed as getting a salary. They're rather independent workers. They're considered as independent workers. And before they can sell the minerals are being analyzed, and then it means that the part of the minerals within the whole volume that they want to sell is very limited because what they want to sell contains water and so on. So the analysis is made by external intermediaries, and they're the buyers themselves, so there's no independence. So miners, well, they criticize the fact that they are not being paid what they deserve because they're being paid less because they're supposed to be selling less of the volume that they want to sell. And well, this is another important point. And then for larger mines, for industrial mines, we have the problem of local population displacements. There are entire villages that have to be displaced so that the extraction can be pursued. And so we're displacing people in a forced manner in some cases, and with no reparation of any kind. And we know also about child labor, and I'm talking about, well, teenagers, for example. In our visits, we've seen many teenagers working in mines, and children also work as craft workers. And I would like to bring a positive touch here. There are some cooperatives and there are some perspectives for change. There is vocational training programs that are being created. And so there are several initiatives, but there's a lot of work to do. And now about semiconductors, I could give you a long list of problems: discrimination, wages, violence, verbal violence, pressure, harassment, forced labor. But maybe we could focus on two main problems. Once more, safety and health, because workers are in contact, or at least part of the workers are in contact with lots of chemical substances. And for many years, we know now that semiconductors are really polluting, and chemical products contained in them are very toxic for the workers who handle them. There is scientific research that supports this, that shows the hazard that this entails, and actually the industry is doing nothing. And Electronics Watch has identified 12 different chemical products, and we're working on this matter. Really, we're working with many partners around this. And then there's another issue, migrant workers. And when I was working with Electronics Watch, I was surprised by the hundreds of thousands of migrants who are crossing borders in Southeast Asia. I remember taking a flight and the plane was full of women workers who were being displaced in order to get to work. So migrant workers are very vulnerable, they're fragile, they do not know about their rights, or they don't know about the situation. I mean, they're prone to all this ups and downs, and actually there's a lot of risk for them. They're being manipulated by brokers who are abusing them economically also, and they have to pay big amounts of money, and with no justification and or nothing at all. So it's really very difficult situations for them. So there's a lot to do as well regarding migrant workers.
Thank you. So I think what is visible is that at every stage of the supply chain, there is not only risk, but there is violations. And we just look at 3 stages of the supply chain. We just look at mining, semiconductors, and battery manufacturing. Risks and violations need to be documented. So the big question is, and please you don't have to go into details here because we are running a bit late. The question is also, what is the risk for monitoring partners? Is there a risk for monitoring partners? Is there a risk for people that actually talk to workers, talk to communities, and try to document risks and rights violations? Claude, what kind of risks are you and your colleagues facing in the DRC?
Human rights and environmental defenders run a number of risks. In a country where violations and intolerance characterize relations between either government, civil society companies, certainly those risks are very high. And you'll understand that these are very high interest areas of monitoring. So, and the DRC is known for corruption and for human rights abuses. So human rights defenders and colleagues face numerous risks, including arrests. Some colleagues have been arrested, death threats. Many have received death threats. Ourselves, we had to move some of our colleagues in some of the province, not necessarily in the Congo, out of the area just to protect them. There are lawsuits, which many activists cannot financially afford. And all this is made to, or the threat, the objective to silence civil society, to make it difficult for them to defend workers and to do their work. So silencing civil society, silencing human rights defenders is mostly the objective of most companies, sometimes even state actors.
Thank you, Claude. That's not good. Is the situation any better, Linda? We just heard that there is new laws coming up in Hungary.
Yeah, however, now I would have highlighted 2 other risks which we also encounter as monitoring people, because and one is which you might not think about first when you are asking this question, but we have already talked about how severe the accidents can be in case of battery factories. And there, when we are reading these detailed descriptions with my colleagues, Christopher Bodor and Clara Nagy, about even fatal accidents and those which could have been prevented, actually, like, for instance, by turning off a machine during its maintenance, that is when the repairman is fixing it, which had not happened and caused the crash of a person's body and death, then yeah, we do feel some kind of mental and emotional strain, which has an effect on our work too. So I think it might be important to mention it at least among ourselves. And but in terms of the risk caused by institutional and structural circumstances, we can say that the outreach to workers at greenfield sites, which is true for all these battery manufacturing investments, may be difficult, either due to the lack of the trade union or the union busting that is going on. And as I said, the state does not really prevent these events, which might make people fear of talking about their situations more openly. But in course of our monitoring work, we have also learned that there are some trade unions who can act as gatekeepers, not letting us get close to the actual workers, but instead pushing us to talk to the management first, which we wouldn't like to do, because obviously that would undermine our worker-driven monitoring method.
Mm. Thank you. And Fabrice, once again to you as a global perspective. When you're talking with monitoring partners in our various regions, what kind of risks are they reporting on their lives, on their well-being when they're doing the work?
I think that generally speaking, when they can be supported by a union, it's better, because the union is going to play the role of facilitating and ensure that the interviews take place in good conditions. But of course, the countries where union freedom is not respected, in Philippines, the practice of red tagging, where there are paramilitary groups with police forces who kill union members. So our partners are exposed, and there's death threats and the death danger.
Okay, thank you. And I think what is important, and we have seen this over the last years, is that any rights defenders in any regions are basically actually getting their areas of work diminished, and the risks are raised for rights defenders. It's not only specific countries. I come from Germany, and we are hearing also very bad news. In Germany, it's a relatively different situation, obviously, but it's a global issue that rights defenders have to face increasing risks. Well, thank you, Claude. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Fabrice, for giving us these insights. We will now turn a bit away from the kind of the work from monitoring partners and turn to the Low Emission Vehicle Programme, or LEVP, as we like to call it, that Electronics Watch has established last year. And welcome, Rocio. Rocio Paniagua Oliver has joined Electronics Watch as the LEVP program manager. And before that, she has headed the business industry program at Transparency International UK. And she also worked with the International Bar Association at the Legal Policy and Research Unit, and was the legal officer at the International Department of the Spanish National Bar Association. Welcome, Rocio. So let's have a look at the Low Emission Vehicle Programme, and why is Electronics Watch actually interested in looking at labor rights in low emission vehicles and battery supply chains?
Thanks very much, Peter. So I think, well, let me just tell you three important reasons why we decided to look into this. First of all, and you mentioned it in the introduction, we are in a situation in that everyone is joining forces to fight against climate change. And that's very important. We need to move from a carbon-based economy to a clean energy economy. But we think that this will only work if the voices of workers and communities are heard. They need to be heard. And also, if human rights are not considered in these actions that are taken to mitigate the effects of climate change, what we are going to see is violations of the rights of vulnerable groups. I think you all have heard what Linda, Claude, and Fabrice have explained. So these were just some examples of violations. So in Electronics Watch, we want to contribute to the energy transition, but we think that this transition needs to be a just, social, and ecological transition. So this is one of the reasons. The second reason is that we are all seeing that at the moment there is an increase of procurement of low emission vehicles in the side of public buyers. Why is this? So just to put you an example, there is legislation that like the EU Clean Vehicle Directive that is driving this demand for low emission vehicles by public buyers. Just to give you some numbers, specifically the target is between 43% and 75% of new buses purchased by public authorities need to be clean or low emission by 2030. This is just one data. So, and the same happened with vehicles. The percentage is from 17.60 to 38% of new cars and vans purchased by public authorities need to be clean or low emission by 2030. So this is going to shift the perspective of public procurement, of course. Finally, we think we are the right people to look into this. We have been working on minerals and semiconductors since we started our work. Particularly, we have been doing monitoring of minerals and semiconductors as Fabrice and was explaining before, and we have been helping buyers into this. And minerals and semiconductors are common components for electronics, but also for low emission vehicles. So this is, I would say, another reason why we created this program.
Thank you. And could you give us a brief, I mean, the program has been now running for 1.5 years.
Yeah.
What did you achieve up until now with the participants in the program?
Mm-hmm. I think, first of all, I'd like to, of course, give credit to our participants. We have in 1.5 years, which is a short period of time, we have increased the number of participants. We have now 10 public buyers that participate in the Low Emission Vehicle Program, and I would like to mention them. These are the Barcelona Council, Flemish Government, FIDO, which is the Federal Institute for Sustainable Development of Belgium. You will hear Joe talking in a minute. We have also the Hamburg Police, City of Oslo, APUC, which is the Advanced Procurement for Universities and Colleges of Scotland. We have Hamburg Hochbahn, which is the public transport of Hamburg. We have Barcelona Metropolitan Transport and Berlin Public Transport Company, and the Greater London Authority, or TfL, and we will hear Linda from TfL talking in a minute. So these are our 10 pioneers, participants, and we have been working very hard with them. We have been developing tools, providing consultancy, support, networking opportunities, and just to highlight, in terms of building their capacity to implement social responsible public procurement, we have provided very critical input to a work that was being developed by 2 of our German members. They developed social criteria for a tender, which they have used in 2 public tenders, and we have worked with them on that. I'm mentioning this because perhaps this was tested recently, but we think this is going to become a trend, and we will continue working on tender tools with them, with all the participants. And then another area that I will want to highlight is supplier engagement. We have done a lot of work on supplier engagement. Just to give you a figure, we have had 18 individual dialogue meetings with 9 of the major LEV manufacturers, bus manufacturers, and some vehicle manufacturers too. And why am I mentioning supplier engagement? And perhaps some of the people in the audience today might have heard me yesterday, but we think that this is essential. Supplier engagement is essential to strengthen human rights due diligence. and we have had some learnings from this engagement. So first of all, unfortunately, the automotive sector is behind other sectors when it comes to human rights due diligence and supply chain transparency. It is behind in compared to ICT or garment. However, we think that public transport companies and public buyers in general, but public transport companies are being heard when they talk about social value requirements. Manufacturers are listening what they have to say, and this is very important because we are seeing a shift in the conversation. But for this successful engagement, I think public buyers need to understand that this needs to be a continuous process. This needs to be collective. It's very important. We have 10 members, but we want to get more public buyers engaging collectively in this conversation, and trust needs to be built. And we think we are in the right path to start receiving information of the factory to address cases or systemic issues in the value chain of the low emission vehicles that public transport purchase.
Thank you, Rocio. And this is kind of a great segue to what everybody knows Electronics Watch is also doing next to monitoring, and that's working with and for public buyers. That's our impact model. That's the strength of what we can deliver both to public buyers as well as obviously to workers. So their working conditions are actually being improved and measurably so. So after we have heard about the situation in battery supply chains, let's turn to the public buyers. Let's turn to them and ask them what their goals are in relation to battery supply chains and how they are working on them. To be able to talk about this, we invited two representatives. That's Lisa Dipnerine and Jo Versteven. Lisa is the Senior Bus Business Development Manager and bus operators at Transport for London and has worked in the organization for over 15 years in various roles. Lisa is responsible for developing and delivering TfL's air quality strategy for the London's bus fleet. Welcome, Lisa. And Jo Versteven is a sustainable development expert at the Belgian Federal Institute for Sustainable Development. For more than 15 years, he has worked on the development of sustainable procurement policy at the Belgian federal level. Welcome, Jo. Let's start with a question, and I will basically put the same question always to both of you, is why has your organization joined the Low Emission Vehicle Programme? Lisa.
Peter, sorry, was that directed at me, Peter?
Yes, please. Why
has gone very poor all of a sudden.
Okay, no problem. Why did Transport for London join the Low Emission Vehicle Programme with Electronics Watch?
Thanks, Peter. I can hear you now. Hopefully you can hear me. So Transport for London is part of the Greater London Authority, and together we're governed by the Mayor of London. The GLA has and TfL, sorry, we have a responsible procurement plan as well as an EV infrastructure strategy. And ultimately, it's looking at how we promote ethical sourcing practices. And from TfL's side, which is where, with the organisation that I work for, the aims and the goals of the LVP but the programme actually matches that of TfL. So we have a commitment to tackle climate change from buses where I sit. We plan to convert the entire bus fleet to zero emission by 2034. And what that means is while TfL doesn't actually buy and own the buses, we procure the buses through the bus operators who operate the routes in London on TfL's behalf. But TfL still needs that understanding of actually where the buses are built, how they're made, where certain materials come from. And, we need to have visibility of how buses are produced from start to finish. And that's why the transparency of how the procurement happens by the bus operators through to the bus manufacturers for us is very important. And we will be buying large volumes of buses. I mean, it's not under, we're talking about, crucially, could be up to 1,000 buses a year. So these are large volumes that we need to have the insight into how the buses are being made.
Thank you, Lisa. And I think everybody knows London and that there are buses in London. It's kind of a link we all have in our heads. Coming to Fido, why did Fido decide to participate in the program?
Good morning, Peter. Good morning, everybody. Maybe to start, first of all, with some numbers also to illustrate the numbers that has been presented by Rocio. In the past, our institute did some monitoring of the Belgian federal car fleet. We did that for about 6 years. And there are, at this moment, 2 things that we can conclude. First of all, that the global federal car fleet is shrinking by about 20% over these 6 years. But at the other side, there is a clear increase of the number of hybrid and electrical cars. So this means that we are going in the way as the objectives in Europe have been presented. So the question is, what are our drivers to join the program from a policy perspective? First of all, so we have the transposition of the European Clean Vehicles Directive, which is important from a governmental point of view. But besides that, the federal administrations also discussed their own federal strategy. Now, in this strategy, we don't only have references to technical procurement issues and to green criteria, but it also refers to a wider policy framework. For example, the strategy indicates the need of a study on concrete federal mobility needs for different modes of transportation for federal personnel. And besides that, the strategy also stresses on the importance of sufficient transparency in the supply chain in the battery sector. And this for the acquisition of vehicles of the federal government. The last point was also inspired by the European regulation on batteries and waste batteries. And in this regulation, there are also clear obligations on environmental and safe batteries for the European markets, but also very concrete paragraphs are taken up there on due diligence. So it could be very an inspiration for procurers also. So to conclude from this European and also the Belgian legal frameworks, our institute decided to collaborate with the Low Emission Vehicles Programme. And we think that this could be an important preparatory work for later due diligence measures for public buyers.
Thank you. So both are very strategically focused organizations. That's really great. Let's maybe go to current activities. What are the most interesting ones around sustainable procurement of low emission vehicles at Transport for London, Lisa?
So thanks, Peter. As mentioned, so TfL doesn't buy the buses themselves. Buses are bought via the operators. But nonetheless, for us, for me, I've been in TfL for such a long time. We have been procuring electric buses mainly from around probably around 2015, 2016 in very small batches. But for us, it's about starting the conversations now with the bus manufacturers. We've never engaged with them in the way that we have done before through Electronics Watch. And you've been on the to see that kind of engagement. We've never spoken about sustainability or due diligence as part of how the buses are actually built and how they're made. And for me, what's also interesting, aside from those conversations, is to also understand what other cities are doing as well. That's really interesting because they're involved in a similar process of either procuring the buses directly or managing it through route contracts through an operator, and it's interesting to understand how they are going to incorporate those sustainable procurement practices through their procurement, because TfL doesn't do that at the moment. We don't, as Rosia mentioned about previously of tendering tools, we don't have that at the moment through our tendering. So it's interesting to see how it develops and how potentially in the future we might be able to incorporate some of these practices into tendering. But overall, from the very early discussions that we've started to have this year, there's a shared interest in a common goal. From what I'm seeing from those conversations, none of the manufacturers are pushing back, that they're quite keen to engage with us, which is really important. And hopefully somewhere along the line, TfL as a big organisation, we're in a good position to influence, and help tackle some of the issues we might see, and how can we take that action? I'm not saying we can solve everything, but we can start through the process of through the LEVP.
Thank you. And what about you, Jo, and Fido?
Yeah. In fact, our institute invested a lot of in European working groups on ethical procurement, but this especially in the IT sector. That's already for 2 years, and the next 2 years we will continue with it. So these policy activities in the ICT sector were and are still important for Belgian procurers from the point of view of peer learning, sectoral trainings, criteria development, and so on. So we hope to find in this ICT sector inspiration also for the battery sector. But of course, the case of ICT is not the same as for the battery sector. For example, from a legislation point of view, there is the European Directive on Due Diligence, and there is a regulation on batteries. But as far as I know, there is not something specific as an European Directive on Sustainable IT, for example. Besides, there is already some experience with monitoring and follow-up on due diligence in IT factories, mining companies, etc. In the battery supply chain, where a lot of new companies are coming up, the due diligence issues can, in principle, be discussed already in some planning phases. So this is referring to the idea of prevention, as mentioned by Fabrice, and especially of some big factories. So from this point of view, I think it's interesting to see how Electronics Watch is setting up a separate program for batteries and vehicle electronics, and not just copying its monitoring instrument from the IT program that it has already. At this moment, the Belgian federal government has made an inventory of priority categories for sustainable public procurement. There is still a lot of discussion on this, but vehicles as well as batteries at this moment are taking up in the top 10 of this classification. So the testing of transparency and due diligence in the supply chain of batteries for Belgian tenders and contracts will probably become important in the coming years, but again, final governmental decisions have to be taken in the coming weeks.
Thank you. We have already mentioned supplier engagement and how important it is, both to understand where your suppliers are in human rights due diligence maturity, as well as to develop leverages. What do you see as challenges and opportunities in such a supplier dialogue? Lisa?
I guess two of the biggest ones are, when you're going through the engagement piece with the bus manufacturers, is gaining that trust and the openness with them. It's not always an easy to do, and you only get that over time when you have conversations with them, and they need to know that we as TfL or you as Electronics Watch are not going to name or shame them in terms of if something is found. It's not about exposing them, it's trying to get that message across to them. We're actually here to help with any situations that might arise. So how do we send that clear message to them that that's what we're here for and that's what we're aiming to do? And from the opportunity side, it kind of flips a bit. Again, we need to work collaboratively with all of our with the manufacturers and all our participants, build those relationships, make sure we get the messaging correct with them, and also show good examples, good practice examples, share knowledge sharing about how remediation, how and where it has worked, and steps where improvements could be made. Again, it's always building on the past work that you've done and kind of moving forward and not going back too negatively on things that may have been found. How do you move forward with all of the things and how do you progress?
Thank you, Lisa. And Yo, you haven't yet been kind of a very active part on the supplier dialogues, but what is your perspective on supplier dialogues within the vehicles market?
Yeah, at federal level in Belgium, there are regular annual buyer meet supplier meetings between the supplier and the Belgian federal consumers, particularly with regard to framework contracts. So the consumers can meet the suppliers and they can ask questions on the delivery of goods of these framework contracts, and attention is also paid to the car offer. So some models are presented and consumers can have talks with the car suppliers. So last year, the focus was more on real consumption. This means the supply in the actual job of the framework contracts. But from our perspective, from our institute, we draw attention on informing suppliers already on beforehand, also on the future sustainability buyer policy. We think that potential and actual suppliers should be informed about the short-term, but also on the long-term procurement policy and the goals of the government. And such a policy should also integrate environmental and human rights due diligence issues into the purchasing policy. And if potential suppliers are aware of this, they also can anticipate on this for the next procurement. But maybe more important, so not just informing the potential buyers on governmental sustainability policies, but I think that also starting a real dialogue, a real discussion with resellers and factories and so on is needed. And it seems to be that there are already similar good examples, similar successes in the IT and the textile sector, for example. So that's built on what we have learned from these sectors for the work that we are doing here in the battery sector. So from the general point of view, buyer meet supplier meetings can be used to present the sustainable buying policies for the government, but more specific categories can be discussed between the two parties, and vehicles and batteries can certainly be one of them.
Thank you. And as a last question on this broad topic of public procurement, there is obviously always the question of evidence. Evidence on compliance, evidence on violations. This is really central to take decisions as a public buyer, but also to really go in these supplier engagement discussions. What kind of evidence are you currently using, and what kind of evidence would you need to have to be really, or to feel informed and to feel able to really engage your suppliers? Let's start with you, Lisa, again.
Thanks, Peter. So I guess I will talk from outside of buses because we don't yet do this within our procurement. And I've spoken to another colleague who directly deals with this at the GLA. And currently what we do is we have the risk-based procurement approach. But the intent and my understanding is for us as the GLA and TfLs to go beyond this when looking at kind of responsible procurement. But I think for us and for me, again, this part being new to me, it's about it's that transparency first, and then you can almost then work out a little bit backwards. Oh, is my sound coming and going? Sorry, I'll hold my mic a bit closer. Sorry about that. I think it might be my connection as well. Yeah, so it's that transparency piece first about talking to suppliers and manufacturers, and then you kind of will build up what evidence and what audits you need to kind of to strengthen your case around on what activities you want to look at, and also possibly for me is this is the approach is new to me in terms of staff training. Is the organisation set up to do this? And are we set up to have these conversations about supply chains? And therefore, do we need specialist staff as a result? So hopefully that's all from me, Peter.
Thank you, Lisa. And Jo, what kind of evidence are you working with, and what kind of evidence would you need in the Belgian federal government?
As far as I can see, I think that our procurers are not yet very experienced with especially accurate due diligence follow-up in the contract phase. Of course, they refer to legal obligations and also to social or ethical legal obligations. But at this moment, capacity is lacking to make social contract follow-up effective. So I will refer to 4 points that I think that are important for the need in the battery sector. First of all, I think that there is a need for interest of the press in the battery supply chain sector. Procurers are driven to action by their politicians, and politicians themselves are driven by press information. In my opinion, this press interest partly explains why Northern European countries invest more in social clauses in their tenders. Second, there are a lot of interesting ideas in the new battery regulation that are directly relevant for procurement. The regulation refers, for example, to environmental obligations, but also to obligations for companies on due diligence policies, on risk assessment, on external verification, on reporting, and also it refers to public procurement. So this is very important. And I think that guidance on these new coming obligations for procurers would be very welcome. Third, confidential documents for procurers on what is effectively happening in their specific supply chain on social and ecological due diligence seems to me necessary to inform the procurers in the contract phase what is happening. And only the point of confidentiality is a very important issue here that have to be taken into account. And lastly, I think what we certainly don't need is something like checkbox mechanisms with a lot of paperwork for procurers and for suppliers and for third parties. The issue is not only important for procurers, but also important for experts doing contract follow-up if these people are not the same as the procurers. So guidance and training also, as Lisa has referred to, should not only be developed for procurers, but also for these contract follow-up experts.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jo. That was a really great overview of what we actually need to do. So looking at the time, we are well behind. But I think that's also a great indication of how important this is and how varied this is. What I wanted to do in the last 10 minutes with you, and I would invite all of the speakers to turn on their cameras now. We basically only have 10 minutes, so I would very strongly ask you to keep your comments short because we want to run through all of our 6 speakers now on the question of remediation. Fabrice already mentioned it. Remediation is actually, and yesterday James Cocaine also mentioned it, if something has become modern slavery, you have missed all the right steps. So if you need to remediate, you actually didn't do your job because your job is to prevent things happening. But still, we are realists. We have to acknowledge we are not there yet. We need to talk about remediation. So again, please stay short so we can run through all of the speakers. Let's start with you, Lisa. What challenges does Transport for London see with regards to remediation?
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's back to my previous kind of point around openness and trust with the bus manufacturers, and how they feel comfortable talking to us, and therefore they feel comfortable coming back to us when they identify issues that are going on and need help with the remediation. And I think there are negative connotations associated with the word remediation, so we need to kind of go back on ourselves and make that sound less negative, and demonstrate that it's something that has happened, and we all need to acknowledge that and take a step forward. I guess in terms of how you make remediation meaningful, from my perspective would be, at level, not just working with the employees in a factory, but also working with local NGOs and also local charities. So you can build trust with not just the workers, but also other local organisations on the ground to show that how important remediation is and how you take that forward. So I'll stop there, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And what was the discussion at FIDO and in Belgium on the question of remediation?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't have much information on remediation influenced by Belgium battery procurement, at least at this moment. Now, that being said, let's try to look at the issue from the perspective of the procurer. I'm not sure if batteries or electronic steering equipment for cars are directly bought by procurers. Instead, car maintenance as a service is. So even if we have an excellent monitoring instrument in the nearby future for batteries and steering electronics, how will this instrument then be integrated into car maintenance contracts, for example? Can procurers still put pressure on their suppliers, as in case of, for example, IT procurement contracts? How will they do it? We should look and test such instruments. And again, I think that a discussion on the battery regulation could be inspiring in developing guidance for procurers. That I said that I'm not sure if batteries are directly bought by procurers, but surprisingly, last week the proposition was urged from several Belgian federal departments to have a framework contract on batteries. The content of this tender is absolutely not clear at this moment. This means that the question on central procurement is coming higher on the list for this product group. Such big contracts often give more opportunities on contract follow-up, also in the field of due diligence and transparency in the supply chain. I'm not sure that our procurers have enough expertise in due diligence without extra support, as I have mentioned already. But things sometimes go very fast and you never know from what angle the best practices will arrive. Anyway, as far as I can see, and as far as the Chinese proverb is saying, these are interesting times to come, in this case, for fair and ecological battery procurements.
Thank you, Jo. Linda, from a perspective of a monitoring partner, what would be the most important to facilitate meaningful remediation?
Well, in the context of global labor shortage, I would first say that state actions could be more favorable towards workers, and instead of actively supporting the fragmentation of labor, could become more attractive and protective towards the foreign workers too. Instead of contributing to a kind of race to the bottom, this would help the situation of the local workers too, actually. But since Hungarian government doesn't seem to go towards this direction, I'm not wasting more time on detailing my recommendations to it. But where we can play an important role is awareness raising. So I think it's very important to provide workers with legal trainings about their rights and possibilities, which was also mentioned by Fabrice. And hopefully this could increase their knowledge and decrease their fears too. And as a related issue, I think the transnationalization of labor organizing is very important. That is scaling up all the efforts which we and trade unions put into labor representation, and actually that's why to scale it up onto an international level, and that's why we're appreciating our cooperation with Electronics Watch so much. And I think it's important to get to remain connected to other monitoring partners who may help us contacting trade unions at the countries where people are coming from to Hungarian battery manufacturing. And this is very helpful, hopefully, and hopefully very beneficial to the effects on the protection of people's labor and human rights in Hungary too.
Thank you. Claude, what is your perspective on improving remediation in the DRC?
Peter, very quickly, no, thank you. I think there are a few type of intervention that can be done. Remediation can only happen in the country like the DRC through, and first and foremost, through state intervention. The state must play its role of enforcing its own laws and legislations. These exist in the DRC and very progressive laws and regulations, but they are not enforced, and the state must play that role. Secondly, the state must also hold companies to account for their commitment to international laws and regulations, especially the ILO conventions, which is an international law that every company needs to follow. We also think civil society must be supported to continue to hold both companies and government to account, to enforce the laws and regulations because they exist, but also these international norms and standards, while they are very good, their voluntary nature allow these companies to evade their implementation sometimes. Increase human right due diligence monitoring. And I think it's important to empower civil society to do shadow reporting, which should be compared and opposed to this very nice design and layout sustainability report of mining companies. We need to strengthen workers' rights to belong to a union. In DRC, they aren't strong unions, and most of them are very not inclined to support and to protect workers. I think we need to invest in organizing labor union in the mining industry in the DRC. We also need to put in place grievance redress mechanism that works for the workers. Currently, it's a top-down where the management decide. And finally, we need to sensitize and train mine workers. This is very important, but it's a very difficult to engage mine workers because companies do not allow these workers to participate in some of this training. But these are some of the intervention we can do for remediation.
Thank you, Claude. Now, Rocio and Fabrice, you have the great opportunity to say one sentence on the topic of remediation.
Okay, I'll start very quickly, and I'm not going to say something that hasn't been said already, but putting workers and its representatives, so trade unions, in the core process of deciding what adequate remedy it is essential. We are not seeing indications that suppliers are already taking this into account. And yeah, that's my sentence.
Thank you. Fabrice.
Well, I totally agree with what my predecessor said, and Electronics Watch has adopted the principle, the guiding principle of this work in order to place the workers into the remedy process. But of course, when there are trade unions, it's very good, but very often there's a lack of trade unions. And this is the case, for instance, in cooperatives, we have found a good practice. And this is the establishment of health and safety committees. And they work. And there are workers there that make up these committees. And I think that this is another good practice that we could implement.
It's a lot about learning. I have learned today again. It's really very complex. It's really very challenging. It was really super interesting. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Rocio. Thank you, Jo. Thank you, Fabrice. And thank you, Claude, for all of your expertise that we have had. Just as a last sentence, if you are a public buyer or you know a public buyer that might be interested in the Low Emission Vehicle Program, that might be interested in actually developing and supporting and leveraging remediation, please do contact either Rocio or myself. We are currently expanding the program a bit, so there are some open places that can be filled. Now, looking at the time, we are 1 minute over, but I wanted to just basically give 3 points. It is really about workers' rights. And what we see is it is not only in mining, it is not only in manufacturing, it is not only in some place in the supply chain, it's actually everywhere. And it's similar. We heard about agency work on all 3 levels. We heard about occupational health and safety on all 3 levels. So just imagine what happens in the levels that we didn't talk about. It is about prevention and not only remediation. We need to get there. This will be step by step. And importantly, public procurement has a leverage. Public procurement has the strength to change things, but it is not about single public bias. We need to learn from each other. We need to learn from what have they done, what have we done, and we need to exchange. And I think this is why models like Electronic Swatch or any other networking where knowledge and learning can be exchanged is really important, because the leverage is not a single organization, a single person. This is something we all can learn from the workers' movement. We only got where we are because workers were understood what solidarity is and actually organized in unions and tried to improve. And this is where we are. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your interest. For all affiliates and monitoring partners, there is tomorrow the next day. For all interested parties, contact Rocio or myself. Have a nice day. Have a nice afternoon or lunch. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.